Congratulations on your purchase of the one and only MyPi. Today, we're going to take you through a step-by-step tutorial on how to assemble your unit so you can take a blast to the past. Let's get started. To begin assembling your MyPi, first, get the LCD adapter board and the two 10-pin sockets. Solder the two sockets to the LCD adapter board as shown. Now, solder the LCD adapter board with the soldered sockets to the underside of your Raspberry Pi. Double check that the 5 VDC indications on the Raspberry Pi and on the LCD adapter board connect to each other to verify correct installation. Connect a pair of 24-gauge wires from the PP25 and PP26 points on the LCD adapter board to the PP25 and PP26 points on the Raspberry Pi. The PP25 and PP26 points are left and right audio from the Raspberry Pi. You may prefer to solder the wires on the back of the Raspberry Pi to the corresponding points on the back of the headphone jack as shown here for a more secure connection. Now connect together the Raspberry Pi assembly and LCD screen. Be sure to use one of the brass posts and a nut to support the screen in the location shown here. Also, you will need to plug in the HDMI adapter plug that connects to the Raspberry Pi and to the LCD screen. Now assemble both of the trigger boards. Simply insert a 12mm button into each trigger board and solder it in place. Solder a 7 cm piece of 24-gauge solid wire to each of the connection points under the buttons. Please be sure to solder the wires so that they exit from the same side that the buttons are mounted on. Now attach the button caps and set the trigger boards aside for now. The D-pad board is prepared next. The first step is to solder the surface mount components in place. Using a pair of tweezers, place the resistor so that it is touching the solder that was just applied. Apply solder to the other side of the SMD resistor and pad, and the resistor soldering should be complete. Repeat the process for the other resistor on the D-pad board. Solder a 6mm button to the top of the D-pad board. Attach the button cap. Now we need to solder sockets to the bottom of the D-pad board for the battery voltage comparator. You may want to align the battery voltage comparator over the socket before soldering the sockets in place, just to be sure that the battery voltage comparator will easily plug into the sockets after they are soldered into position. Solder the 10-position header onto the underside of the D-pad board just above the battery voltage comparator sockets. To connect the Class D audio amplifier, we need to first solder a 5-pin header for the amplifier board to the underside of the D-pad board. Place the amplifier board face down onto the 5-pin header on the underside of the D-pad board. Hold the amplifier board level, or place a spacer between the D-pad board and the amplifier board to hold it level and solder it into position. Now flip the D-pad board to the top surface and solder 2 pieces of solid 24-gauge wire to one of the speakers. Use a double-sided sticky pad and place it over the sticker symbol on the D-pad board. Place the speaker in position and measure the wire to attach the amplifier connection through the holes on the D-pad board. Solder the speaker in position and press it down to the sticky pad to hold it in place. Lastly, solder one of the trigger boards to the D-pad board and set it aside for now. Now we need to work on the fire buttons board. The first step is to solder the surface mount resistor in place. We do this the same way as earlier. Place a little solder on one solder pad and attach the resistor while holding the resistor with a pair of tweezers. Next, solder the other side of the resistor into position. Flip over the fire buttons board and solder the surface mount MOSFET into position using the same techniques used to solder the surface mount resistors into position. Keep in mind that additional heat may be needed to properly secure the MOSFET. Locate the thumb wheel potentiometer and solder it to the back of the fire buttons board. A Class D audio amplifier will need to be soldered to the underside of the fire buttons board. First, solder a 5-pin header for the amplifier board to the underside of the fire buttons board. Place the amplifier board face down onto the 5-pin header on the underside of the fire buttons board. Solder the 10-position header in place on the underside of the fire buttons board. Solder the 11-position header into place on the underside of the fire buttons board inside of the power supply outline. Solder the battery connector to the underside of the fire buttons board. Next, locate the USB board and solder 2 pieces of 24-gauge solid wire to the respective points. Be sure to solder one wire to the ground indicator. Solder the remaining wire to the positive voltage point on the USB board. Solder the 2 wires connected to the board to their corresponding points on the underside of the fire buttons board. The remaining 6mm tactile button will need to be mounted to the top of the fire buttons board, and the button cap will need to be attached. Finally, solder one of the trigger boards to the D-pad board and set it aside for now. Next, locate the case bottom and place the completed D-pad board inside. Place the completed fire buttons board into the case bottom while aligning the slide switch and USB port into position. After verifying that the 2 boards fit correctly and the screw holes align, remove the boards from the case bottom. Now it is necessary to connect the LCD module, D-pad board, and fire buttons board by plugging each board into each corresponding socket on the LCD adapter board. Place the completed electronics assembly into the case bottom, being sure to align the slide switch and USB port board positions with their mounting holes. After the electronics are put into position in the case's bottom section, screw down the D-pad board and fire buttons board. The next step is to electrically connect the D-pad board and fire buttons board together by soldering the bat and odd pads of each board to one another. However, before moving on to the next step, do a test fit of the case top to make sure that everything fits. Now solder the D-pad and fire buttons boards together. It is easier to do this by first removing the black button caps to provide a bit more space. Strip and cut a solid piece of 24 gauge wire and solder it across the gap at the bat and odd points between the boards to bridge them together. Do not clean the solder connections while the boards are connected to the LCD module. The LCD module is sensitive to heat and chemical fumes and can easily become damaged by either, so remove the LCD module first and reconnect it after the cleaner has dried completely. The completed electronics now need to be removed so that we can install the lithium battery. You may choose to install the battery before soldering the boards together, but we just wanted to make sure that everything else fit correctly without any interference first. You may have noticed that we are using a cylindrical lithium-ion battery. This battery is rated for only 2200 mAh. After placing the lithium battery into its position, secure the battery in the case using a piece of Gorilla Tape. Place the completed electronics back into the case bottom. Before screwing the boards down, verify that the battery will not be contacted by any header pins. Next, place the rubber D-pad buttons pad over the D-pad contact points. Now place the plastic D-pad over the rubber buttons pad. Before installing the case top, it will be necessary to put the colored fire button caps into their respective holes. The holes on the case may need to be slightly sanded to make them smoother. On the front of the MyPi case, there are two tiny holes. Locate a 2mm light tube and identify the end of the tube that is largest in diameter. This is the end of the tube that will be on top of the case. After you have made any adjustments to the holes, feed the light tube through one of them, being careful not to bend it. Do the same with the remaining hole. Now plug in the battery and place the battery wire into the case, making sure that it will not be touching the power supply. Before installing the top half of the case, verify that the HDMI connector between the Raspberry Pi and LCD display is inserted. Also, the USB port board must be attached using the black self-tapping screws. The first time that the case top is put on, it should be done without the speaker covers attached, or they could be temporarily attached so that the speakers can be properly aligned within the holes. Make sure that everything is aligned correctly and tighten the bottom and top case sections together using the last 4 screws. And that's it! You have finished the assembly of your very own MyPi portable retro gaming system.